one of the big regulatory systems of the human body, we talked about the nervous system last week. This week, we're going to talk about the endocrine system. And this is really where we see a lot of intracellular communication. Intracellular communication helps to maintain homeostasis. It's mostly accomplished through chemical messengers. Distant communication is coordinated by the endocrine and the nervous systems. Nervous system is much faster, as we talked about last week, more specific destinations and short-lived effects, better coordination of response to emergencies. The endocrine system is much slower, releases hormones in the bloodstream with long-lasting effects. Hormones tend to bind to target cells or tissues. The target cell has to have a receptor in order to respond to a hormone. Different kinds of receptors for different hormones may be on a cell. Multiple tissues or organs can be affected by a single hormone. The nervous system and endocrine systems, by comparison, they both rely on the release of chemicals that bind to specific receptors on the target cells. Both share some chemical messengers. You have epinephrine and norepinephrine, for example. They are called hormones when they are released from the adrenal medulla gland, but they are called neurotransmitters when they are released across synapses. Acetylcholine is one that we talked about. Both are regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. Both coordinate and regulate activities of other cells, tissues, organs, and systems to maintain homeostasis. So the endocrine system, this includes all of your endocrine cells. The cells are glandular secretory cells, so they're essentially glands. Secretions enter the extracellular fluid. Local hormones, such as prostaglandins, will affect adjacent cells. But the actual definition of a hormone is that it's a long distance messenger. And hormones are chemical messengers that are released in one tissue and transported by the bloodstream to target cells in other tissues. So here are your endocrine glands. We have the hypothalamus, which is more of a regulatory gland for most of the endocrine glands, specifically the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, we have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. We'll talk about that. We have a thyroid gland, adrenal glands, which are located on top of the kidneys, pancreas, important for insulin and glucagon, pineal gland, secretes melatonin, parathyroid gland, secretes parathyroid hormone, and then various organs throughout the body that can have, obviously they're not endocrine organs per se, such as the heart, kidneys, gonads, but they actually secrete hormones. So they do have somewhat of an endocrine function. Make sure that you do know which hormones come from which gland and what the function of those hormones is. So hormones alter operations of the target cell. They change the types and activities, locations, or quantities of structural proteins and enzymes. The sensitivity of target cell to a hormone depends on the presence or absence of receptors for that hormone. Receptors are located either on the plasma membrane or inside the cell. And here we can see, essentially what happens is the endocrine gland will secrete the hormone, and then that will travel through the bloodstream and eventually bind to whatever the target cell is, whether it's muscle, whether it's a neuron, whether it's heart, whether it's whatever the target cell is. So hormones will rapidly enter into the blood and distribute throughout the body. They are freely circulating. Hormones are short-lived. They are inactivated when they diffuse to the target cells and bind to the receptors. They are absorbed and broken down in liver and the kidney. They are broken down by enzymes in plasma or interstitial fluid. Hormones are bound to transport proteins, and they stay in circulation longer. Each hormone has an equilibrium between bound and free forms. And the control of endocrine activity, there's three control mechanisms. You have humoral stimuli. Humoral regulation is essentially due to conditions. So for example, if blood calcium levels drop, you secrete a hormone. Blood calcium levels come up, you stop secreting that hormone. That's humoral stimuli. Hormonal stimuli. This is the regulation is from one hormone regulates the secretion of another hormone. And neural stimuli is the nervous system regulates the secretion of a hormone. So the three different regulatory mechanisms there. The hypothalamus and endocrine control. Hypothalamus provides the highest level of endocrine control. Coordinating centers in the hypothalamus regulate nervous and endocrine systems in three ways. The hypothalamus secretes ADH and oxytocin, which travel along neurons into the posterior pituitary, and then they are released. The hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting regulatory hormones to control the anterior pituitary hormones. The hypothalamus contains the autonomic nervous system centers that control the adrenal medulla through sympathetic innervation. So essentially here you can see, the hypothalamus, this structure here within the brain, really controls a lot of the hormones of the anterior and posterior pituitary. And actually the posterior is not a gland. It's not making those hormones. They're actually made by the hypothalamus, and they will be secreted via the posterior pituitary gland. This is ADH and oxytocin. So they're actually made by the hypothalamus. They're stored in the posterior pituitary, and they're released when the hypothalamus tells them to release it. The anterior pituitary gland actually makes its own hormones, but it's under the regulation of the hypothalamus. So looking at the pituitary gland, you're going to secrete 9 hormones, 2 from the posterior and the rest from the anterior pituitary. So the pituitary gland is broken up into anterior and posterior components, as shown here. So the anterior lobe contains endocrine cells, and the cells are surrounded by a complex capillary bed, which is referred to as the hypophyseal portal system. Essentially, this is the link between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And you can see that here, this little capillary network right here between these cells. So between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, the hypophyseal artery delivers blood to the first capillary bed in the upper infundibulum. Regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus travel through the portal veins to the second capillary bed in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And then they will have their effects on the anterior pituitary to secrete whatever hormones the hypothalamus just told it to secrete or inhibit. So the 7 hormones from the anterior lobe are thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, growth hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. So the first one is thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also called thyrotropin. Thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid gland, and it stimulates the release of thyroid hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, this is called ACTH or corticotropin. It's released in response to corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Targets the adrenal cortex. It stimulates the secretion from the glucocorticoids, and it increases in glucocorticoids, cause decrease in, adrenocorticotropic hormone or that of corticotropin releasing hormone. Your gonadotropins, these are your FSH and LH. They're going to act on the gonads to secrete their hormones, which would be things like testosterone and estrogen. So FSH specifically promotes follicle development in females, and it promotes sperm production in males. LH induces ovulation and secretion of estrogens and progesterone in females. In males, it's also called interstitial cell stimulating hormone. It stimulates interstitial cells of the testes to produce androgens such as testosterone. Estrogens, progesterone, and androgens will all inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone, which will help to decrease the levels of luteinizing hormone. Prolactin, this is released in response to prolactin releasing factor from the hypothalamus. I'm not too concerned that you guys know the regulation here. I'm more concerned that you know what the hormone is and what it targets. I know I have the regulatory information listed here, but again, when you guys are studying, just know what the hormone is, where it's secreted from, and what its effect is. So prolactin is going to target the mammary glands in females. With other hormones, it'll stimulate mammary gland development. In pregnancy and nursing, it will stimulate the production of milk. Growth hormone. Again, growth hormone is going to be regulated by the hypothalamus. But what does growth hormone do? What does growth hormone accomplish? It stimulates cell growth and replication of cells, but especially skeletal muscles and chondrocytes, meaning it's going to help to bulk up bone and muscle there, density. Growth hormone stimulation will act on epithelial and connective tissues, causing stem cell division and differentiation. Adipose tissue, which will cause the breakdown of stored fats and the release of fatty acids. In the liver, it causes the breakdown of glycogen reserves and release of glucose into the bloodstream. And then finally, the seventh hormone is melanocyte stimulating hormone. MSH is secreted during fetal development in very young children, pregnant women, and certain diseases. And it actually appears to be non-functional in adults. The posterior gland. With the posterior gland, you are essentially not producing these hormones, but you will secrete ADH and oxytocin. So ADH is is antidiuretic hormone. It is also referred to as vasopressin. ADH gets released when the body is low on water. It's stimulated by increased concentration of solutes in the blood or decrease in blood volume and pressure. The primary target of ADH is the kidneys, to essentially tell the kidneys to retain water. Oxytocin is released in women, which will stimulate the contraction of uterine muscles during labor and delivery. It also stimulates the contraction of cells surrounding milk secretory cells in the mammary glands. And it also can play a role in sexual activity, especially in libido. This is just a summary of the 7 hormones from the anterior pituitary and the 2 hormones that get secreted from the posterior pituitary, and their overall what they regulate. And then this is a nice table because this table actually summarizes, the this table is going to summarize the hormones, their targets, and their effects, which is what you need to know. Okay, so this is a very good table to come back to just to have out when you're doing your assignments or doing your quiz. Okay. Okay, so the thyroid gland is found in the anterior, it's anterior to the trachea, but inferior to the larynx, so it's found in the neck region. And here's the thyroid gland. I just want to point out something is that a lot of times, especially females, might have issues with the thyroid gland, and it causes such dysregulation that they need to go in and kill the thyroid gland. And the way they do this is they actually will treat you with radioactive iodine because that's the only spot in the body that uses iodine. And the reason why they do this instead of surgically going in to remove the thyroid gland is that look at where the thyroid gland is located. The thyroid gland is located nestled right in between a lot of very important blood vessels there, especially a lot of very important blood vessels that are feeding into the brain. And And it's just too risky to go in and try to surgically remove that when they can, sort of kill it by other means. Okay. Oh, excuse me. So the effects of thyroid hormones will essentially affect pretty much every cell in your body. It increases the rate of ATP production in mitochondria. It activates genes coding for enzyme synthesis. Enzymes increase rate of metabolism. You also see thyroid hormones essential for normal development of skeletal, muscular, and nervous systems. Thyroid hormone can also thyroid gland will also produce calcitonin. Calcitonin is a hormone that will essentially stimulate increases in plasma calcium levels, essentially blood calcium levels. So calcitonin gets secreted when calcium levels are low, and this will actually inhibit osteoclast in bone, which is the breakdown of calcium in bone. Your parathyroid glands, these are small glands that are embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid. They actually are going to secrete parathyroid hormone, which are stimulated by a decrease in plasma calcium, and you'll see an increase in activity of osteoclast. So with calcitonin, that's if your blood calcium levels are too high. Parathyroid hormone is if your blood calcium levels are too low. And this just is a little summary between the regulation between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone there. The adrenal gland, these glands are located on top of the kidneys. Okay, so the adrenal gland, again, is located on the top of the kidneys right here. And there's two regions, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Essentially, if you see the word cortex, that means the outer part. So this would be the perimeter right here. Medulla would be the inner part. So the adrenal cortex is actually going to secrete several hormones, and these are called corticosteroids. And these corticosteroids are going to be mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. You do not need to know the specific regions of where they're coming from. The mineralocorticoids, these would be examples for aldosterone. They are secreted in response to low plasma sodium or low blood pressure or high plasma potassium. And essentially what aldosterone will do is it will trigger the reabsorption and retention of sodium ions. One thing when we get to the urinary system that you'll find out is whenever we move sodium ions, we're also going to move water. So by reabsorbing sodium, we are also reabsorbing water. So that's what you'll see with that. The glucocorticoids, these are going to increase the rates of glucose synthesis and glycogen formation. Glycogen is how we actually store glucose, resulting in increased blood glucose levels. Glucocorticoids can also act as anti-inflammatory agents. Again, just know what these hormones are responsible for. The androgens, small quantities are produced in both males and females. Some are converted to estrogens in plasma. They stimulate the development of pubic hair in boys and girls before puberty. They're not important in adult men. In adult women, they produce muscle mass, blood cell formation, and they support sex drive. The adrenal medulla, this is going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Mostly the hormone that gets secreted is the epinephrine over norepinephrine, about 75% of the time, or 3 times as much. And these are essentially your fight or flight hormones. So they will target the heart, muscle, adipose tissue, and liver, and they essentially will support an overall sympathetic response, or that fight or flight response. The pineal gland, this is located near the third ventricle of the brain, and this will secrete melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that will help to regulate your day-night cycles. You can actually purchase melatonin as a vitamin or a supplement, and some people believe that taking melatonin actually helps them sleep. I shouldn't say believe. It actually does help some people sleep, especially if you do a lot of shift work. This might be something that could be helpful for that. Okay, the pancreas. The pancreas is going to play a role in the digestive system, and it's going to have an exocrine function. We'll talk about that when we get to the digestive system. But it also does have an endocrine function, and that is that it secretes insulin and glucagon. And insulin is going to be secreted when your blood glucose levels are high, and insulin will actually lower your blood glucose levels. Glucagon is the opposite hormone. Glucagon will be secreted when your blood glucose levels are low and for you to increase your blood glucose levels by pulling from reserves. So insulin and glucagon respond directly to blood glucose levels. Secretion of insulin and glucagon can occur without neural or endocrine system instructions. They are indirectly affected by any hormone that also influences blood glucose levels. They're also affected by autonomic nervous system activity. And here's a nice little thing that sort of shows that relationship between insulin and glucagon there. I'm sure many people are aware that we have one particular disease referred to as diabetes. There's two forms, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is inadequate insulin production. Type 2 diabetes display insulin resistance, where tissues do not respond properly to the insulin that is being secreted. Secondary endocrine organs. Many organs secrete hormones, but their primary function is another system. This would include the intestines, kidneys, heart, thymus, and gonads. So the testes, these will secrete local hormones that coordinate digestive activities, major control over the digestive process, and it can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. Hormones that are released by the kidneys, you have calcitriol. This is stimulated by parathyroid hormone. It's derived from vitamin D3, and it increases the absorption of calcium. That's why oftentimes if you take calcium supplements, you'll also see that it's supplemented with vitamin D. The kidneys will also secrete erythropoietin, or EPO. This is going to be a chapter that we're going to get into after the midterm. And this is stimulated by low oxygen levels in kidney tissues. It causes increase in red blood cell productions. Renin, this is stimulated by a drop in blood pressure or blood volume. It triggers a hormonal chain reaction, referred to as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, to increase blood pressure and blood volume. The heart will actually secrete atrial natriuretic peptide. This promotes loss of sodium and therefore water. The heart would secrete this hormone if your blood pressure is too high, and by secreting water, that can help to lower that blood pressure. The thymus, which is located deep to the sternum in the mediastinum, this is very active in early childhood. It actually atrophies in adults. It secretes thymosins, which aid in the development and maintenance of the immune system. And then we have our gonads, which would be the testes for males. These will secrete testosterone. Testosterone is going to promote sperm production, maintain secretory glands of the reproductive tract, determine secondary sex characteristics, stimulate protein synthesis. Sperm production balance is maintained by inhibin, and it's also secreted by nerve cells in the testes. In females, this is the female sex cells, or the oocytes, are surrounded by ovarian follicles. Estrogens will support the maturation of egg cell and growth of uterine lining. Inhibin will provide negative feedback to follicle stimulating hormone. And then you also have progesterone. This will accelerate, fertilized egg movement through the uterine tube, prepares the uterus for the arrival of developing embryo, and it contributes to the mammary gland enlargement. And then finally, leptin. This is produced by your adipose tissue. This provides negative feedback, control of appetite. Essentially tells you that you're full. Okay. And that's it. That's it for the endocrine system.